lot for us to learn from yourselves. Therefore, I think there's a lot for us to learn from yourselves in terms of and I'd ask for yourselves, if he could go back 5 or 10 years, what would you do differently, or what do you think the left should have done differently in your countries to maybe stem the rise more? And if we can learn that and try to apply some of those lessons from elsewhere to Ireland, I think we can have a big impact. So just to give a bit of the background, I don't mean to say racism has always been an issue in Ireland. Even you go back to 2004, the government at that stage ran a racist referendum to remove birthright citizenship. They organised it on the same day as local and European elections to try to boost the reactionary vote and to distract from the health and housing crises. And of course, with the expansion of the EU and migrants coming here from Eastern Europe, there was a certain amount of racist attitudes there. But even during that time, the main anti-establishment voices, the anger of working class people, was at that stage still generally directed in a left-wing fashion. The economy was seen as being booming, but it was the rich that were getting all the benefits. And you had big struggles, such as in workplaces like Gamma and Irish Ferries, which were based on solidarity between Irish and migrant workers against the race to the bottom. And even then, when you had the crash in Ireland, the key people seen as responsible for the crash were the bankers and the politicians. The austerity that was done was blamed primarily on the bailout on the banks. The role that the ECB and the IMF played in enforcing austerity meant that nationalism that grew was largely of a left-wing coloration. And you had, during the crash, primarily a growth in the left, the socialist left, but also Sinn Féin on a left populist programme. So you had a decade there of the growth of anti-austerity struggles, hand in hand with LGBT rights, the marriage equality struggle, the abortion rights movement. You had a growing refugee solidarity movement, which managed to win a commitment from the government in their programme only 4 years ago. When this government came into office, they promised to abolish what was called the system of direct provision, which sort of stops asylum seekers from being allowed to work and keeps them living separately. So up until 4 years ago, sort of the general trend was towards the left. I don't mean to prettify it. There was always racism, but I think that the situation has declined substantially in the last 2 or 3 years in Ireland. I'll go into the precise details of what happened, but first to give sort of broader outlines as to why. I think there's 5 big picture things that happened. So one is we've had 10 years now of an unresolved housing crisis. And increasingly the establishment has succeeded in establishing the notion that the housing crisis is a reality that we just have to deal with. That there's not enough houses, so therefore you have to fight amongst yourselves for the handful of houses that there are. Two, we have seen a drift to the right by Sinn Féin, in particular, that they have since 2020 they've been trying to present themselves as a safe pair of hands, getting ready for government, taking a sort of Starmer-like political approach of not saying too much, just saying that all of the problems will be resolved when we're in government, but not really saying how, or not giving people an enemy in a real way, or any sort of moving away from some of the left populist rhetoric that got them success in the first place, and trying to court more a middle ground as they saw it. But that actually left the streets, the anger the streets were then being able to be taken by the right, and the anger in working class communities wasn't being directed in the left direction, and the right were able to get in there. Then thirdly, the third big picture thing that I think impacted was the COVID and the refugee crises, which provided big organising potentials for the far right, anti-mask protests, anti-lockdown protests, but also anti-refugee protests in recent years as well. Fourth, I think a contributing factor in a bigger picture sense was the changing position of Ireland in the world system. Whereas historically Ireland is very much a peripheral country, the first colony or whatever, but also being on the blunt end of the stick in terms of EU and IMF austerity. We increasingly it is changing its position now with a tax haven role, a certain being more and more part, or seeing itself more and more as part of the core of Europe, maybe having more of a stake in the system, having more to lose, that there's poorer countries behind us in people's heads that are chomping at the bit to take our place, kind of thing. And that's provided a bit of a a basis for a more right-wing, anti-migrant variety of nationalism. And the fifth big picture contributing factor, I think, has been the intervention and the influence from the US and the UK far right. So that's indirect, just in the sense of like the media that people are consuming here. Here you hear a lot about Trump, you hear a lot about like the Britain, the Boris Johnson, and all of that sort of, and all of the stuff that was happening there. So all of that sort of anti-migrant rhetoric is heard here. But also indirectly. But then there was also very much direct interventions, particularly after the abortion rights victory. A lot of the Christian right in the US funneled a lot of money into right-wing media projects here. But also with the trans rights victory in Ireland, we've seen, which went through completely unopposed at the time. But you saw some anti-trans organisations from Britain trying to fund and develop a anti-trans movement here in Ireland. So there's some of the big picture things that happened. Just in a bit more detail as to what exactly happened in Ireland. So the first early successes that the far right had here was in opposing those direct provision centres that I said, the refugee asylum centres, which were controversial on the left as well, because we wanted people not to be cordoned off into centres, but to be allowed to work and live a decent quality life. But they became a focal point for right-wing opposition as well, particularly in rural Ireland, opposing them going in, feeding off of frustrations at the lack of investment in rural communities. That was their first big thing where they succeeded in getting some echo in local communities. But then in advance of COVID. But then the big breakthrough for them took place during COVID. They were able to organize some large anti-lockdown, anti-mask protests. And then I get a certain echo on social media and all. And then more recently, the Ukraine war, Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine, and the impacts that that's had in terms of mass exodus of refugees has given them, and a broader, like a perceived refugee crisis has then been at the ongoing, for the last number of years, basis of their campaigning. There was some, initially Ukrainian refugees here were given slightly better conditions than non-Ukrainian refugees, and that led to some propaganda against their supposedly luxurious conditions that they got, which is not true. But more important or more significant has been that, like, the government, the non-Ukrainian refugees, they've been then shifted from those centres into more local centres, or into living in tents in more recently, and that's provided focal points for far right action, more focused on the non-Ukrainian refugees than the Ukrainian refugees. So, for instance, in late 2022, we saw the first big anti-migrant protest in a place called East Wall in Dublin, hard-pressed working class community neglected for decades, where a migrant centre was proposed to go in. And then in early 2023, we saw similar protests at a migrant encampment, tents that were put up in a place called Sandwich Street in Dublin that ended up being burnt down by far-right fascist thugs. And that sort of established a certain pattern that where these centres or tent encampments even pop up, that the far right go in, whip up lots of fear, scaremongering, lies, have some sort of protests initially, and then if they manage to get an echo for those protests, they escalate it to direct intimidation and firebombing the centres. We've had about 20 arson attacks in the past number of years on refugee accommodation centres, and a huge amount of those have been in the last 24 months. But it is a fairly modern and recent enough phenomenon. The political response in Ireland to that has been multifaceted. So, first of all, the left had a very strong response initially after that East Wall and Sandwich Street thing in late 22, early 23. We organised People for Profit initiated a massive Ireland for All anti-racist march, which saw 30,000 take to the streets in March 2023. And that succeeded for a time in countering, in reclaiming the streets and in sort of debunking the momentum or knocking the momentum that the far right had. But then in late 2023, there was another big incident where there was a stabbing in a city centre stabbing, which the far right then seized to organise a racist riot in the city centre late last year. And then for the last 6 to 9 months in the run up to the local and European elections, the government increasingly leaned into this, seeing it as an opportunity. So they started leaving emergency accommodation spaces empty and turfing refugees out onto the streets, giving them tents instead of housing them even in the substandard emergency accommodation, giving them tents and telling them to sleep on the streets, which then provided focal points for far right agitation. And then that allowed, and like attacks on those things, that allowed then the government to both simultaneously condemn the protests, and present themselves as the sensible middle ground, condemning the protests, but at the same stage presenting themselves as getting tough on the issue of migration in the lead into the elections. So they started restricting the rights and conditions for refugees. They started themselves sending in public sector staff and to clear out these tents. On the one hand, they gave refugees the tents and told them to go camp, and on the other hand, they sent in trucks to clear out the tents, making it a daily issue in the news, where they could claim to be the sensible middle ground, both getting tough on it, but also like condemning the violence of the far right, and that all helped make migration a central issue in the recent elections, and caused a real problem for Sinn Féin. So Sinn Féin in particular then fell for this trap. They ended up in the election supporting all of the cutbacks, all of the cruel measures the government announced all their getting tough on migrants. Sinn Féin supported all of those things, and they actually advocated going further. They advocated more severe cuts to the conditions for refugees. And they made the opposition to so-called open borders. Sinn Féin made that a big part of their local and European elections literature. But the problem is no one believes that Sinn Féin are more anti-migrant than Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael. Anybody that's predominantly motivated by anti-migrant sentiments is voting for the far right or the establishment parties. They're not going for the left. So Sinn Féin alienated their left-wing voters by doing that, but they didn't actually manage to win any of these votes either. And then they ended up having one of the worst, or they had very, very bad local and European elections, down from maybe 30% in some of the opinion polls to 12 or 13% in the actual elections. And now the government has succeeded in establishing, while the establishment parties are still far below 50% in support, they now have a path to manage to maintain, to winning the next general election potentially by a coalition between themselves, the two big parties, and the far right independents. Whereas only 24 months ago, the assumption was that Sinn Féin were going to lead the next government. Yes. So then what next? Finally, just to wrap up, what next in Ireland? So first of all, I think we need to see more genuine united fronts, organising mass protests like we had with the Ireland Fall protests, but also countering fascist aggression on the ground and counter protests and stuff like that. 2, countering their propaganda. I think online is crucial. It's a space that we're pretty much winning at, but also in the communities, in the workplaces, and in the unions, we need to be countering this the racist propaganda. So People for Profit is doing that already. We have public reps, councillors, and TDs in many of the key areas also being targeted by the far right. So we're in a direct conflict with them. But we need to be doing more out in rural Ireland and outside of Dublin as well, where the left is less strong. And then thirdly, I think we need to be pushing for the left, the broad left, to be taking the streets, tapping into the anti-establishment mood and directing it in a left-wing direction. So we've been pushing for years for a big housing demonstration, but the trade unions in Sinn Féin have been reluctant to have a big protest about housing. Let's try to do that. But we need to be putting that the left needs to be building protests against the government, against the establishment, but presenting it as being against the landlords and the rich, the bankers, and against wealth inequality rather than, Thirdly, I think is this push for what we're calling a left front in the upcoming elections. And so arguing for Sinn Féin to stop this drift to the right, to stop making concessions to the anti-immigrant movement, and instead go back to fighting an anti-capitalist, anti-bosses, anti-landlord messaging, and let's stand together, present a left alternative to the establishment parties, and fight for a left government. The truth is they're very unlikely to do that. They're likely to try to chart the middle course. So therefore, we're facing what is going to be quite a complex opportunity, a situation in the next few years, where we will likely see Sinn Féin continuing gravitating towards the centre, opening up anger and a space both to their left and to their right, and a real contest in that space that PPP needs to be present. And the final thing that I'll say, and therefore PPP needs to be present, and we need to be building a broad socialist alternative, and within that a revolutionary Marxist current. And then the final thing that I'll say is just that this is all very soon. There's a general election likely in November now, where there will be concretely Paul Murphy TD, who's a Rise member and PPP TD in Dublin, faces a strong challenge from a populist right-wing MMA fighter who's whipping up opposition to a refugee accommodation in the area. He's made vile, sexist and homophobic comments, and he is now coming to try to take that seat from us, and there's a real chance of that. So we will need a big campaign to try to defend that seat. Like, Paul has been the most outspoken TD speaking out against the rise of the far right, and therefore has been targeted by them. They've had protests outside his house targeting his family and all of that. So we will need supporters to come over if they can, if anybody can come and help us out in that campaign to defend this seat and to beat the far right and maintain a strong voice for socialism. That would be okay.
Thank you very much, comrade. You've told us so much. I think it's really good you started mentioning the housing problem, because we've had a housing crisis in this country for years too. We've now got a Labour government which is going to build housing, but it's not going to build affordable housing, so we'll still have a housing crisis. And you've talked about how the whole issue of hatred of refugees and prejudice against refugees is mobilised, and how these issues around migration are weaponised. And these are so relevant, the things you'll be talking about. Can I say to you, best of luck with the election, good wishes for that. So thank you very much for your contribution. Hope you are able to join the meeting, even if you're walking down and about. But thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much. Right. Our second speaker is from Germany, Raphael Polti. And our comrade is coming from Germany. He's a member of the National Socialist Organization in Frankfurt, Maine, works in a youth centre, helped set up the protest against the destruction of social services, and is an activist in the climate movement and the trade union movement. So can I invite our second speaker, Raphael, would you like to join us? You're very welcome. Thank you very much for coming to the meeting.
Hello. I want to talk a little bit about the situation in Germany, and I will focus on the biggest and most powerful party in Germany, AfD. I thought you heard of it, but I will give a little input about how they are organized. So it was founded in 2013 as a Euro-skeptical party and developed over the time from Euro-skeptical to far right, and like for example, in the first election they were like, everybody laughed about them. It was like they start bringing back a old German currency, and nowadays they like have reached power. And in a very important aspect is like in the development of the AfD, it was already a party for middle and upper class, but did like they were for the oppressed classes. And when they grew, they also stealed a big part of voters of Die Linke. Maybe Die Linke is out of German parliament, it's the most left party, but and the problem with AfD is that they reached to create a new image of the extreme right. They're very good speakers. That's one of the big problem, and especially during this COVID crisis and with refugees, they reached to power, and like they changed over the time. They changed from a Europe skeptic a little bit, like kind of ridiculous party, to a very hard right-wing party. And nowadays even they are suspected by German inter secret service, like it's called the Verfassungsschutz, because they even for the middle class, they are too far right. Yes, and they have like different groups in their party. To mention, it's called Der Flügel, and out of this group, there's a Björn Höcke. Maybe you heard of him. He's the one of the most dominating guys of AfD, and he's a clear fascist. And even this is allowed to say because once he got in front of court and complained because he was called a fascist, and the judge said, no, you are a fascist. Like, it's okay to tell you like this. So even there, it's okay. Yes. And yeah, the AfD is a very racist and sexist and homophobic party, but also like it's one of the most neoliberal party, and it's a party for the rich, to say a little bit reduced. And they want to they in the program they are from time to time they want to reduce the influence of state and give more liberties to economics. So it's like, yeah, big problem. The problem is also that they have like good connections to youth. They have a very strong youth organization, and on the platforms where the youth is getting their information, like TikTok, they are very good represented. Like, they have very not good in a like not good content, but they have good way of of bringing their content up to young people. And like, for example, they were voted by many young people because of this. And interesting is that like this party is very based on men. Only 70% are women. Yes. And interesting is like in Germany, they are growing, especially in the East and Eastern Germany. And this year, we're going to have some regional elections. So in Germany, there's the Bundestag for once. And on the other side, there are regional parliaments where get elected every 4 years, like Bundestag. And at this regional elections, we are at this point that many forecasts assume that they get around 30 or 35% in Sachsen. It's a Bundesland. It's a region in Eastern Germany, and so it probably may be the first government of the far right in this time, because like the biggest conservative party, CDU, they had like this they talked a lot about hard lines and not to cooperate with left or right, but their chairman Friedrich Merz mentioned that he gonna be like open and not that is once he said like it possibly could be that on a regional base there could be cooperations between AfD and CDU, and so that's a big problem. But he got a lot of critics, and he got back and stepped back and was okay. No, we don't do this. But I think it's an important point to see that the conservatives tested if the time is right to cooperate with the far right, and that's very dangerous. And yeah, that's another topic is that like in Germany there's some climate movements growing. For example, there was one called Last Generation, and interesting point is that they did a lot of protests, which how can I say, which doesn't which sorry a lot of protests blocking streets and something, and this way of action was used by the right and conservative to agitate against them. So there was like created as like they were talking about a new climate RAF. I mean, maybe you have heard it. It was a very left group called Terror Group. It's another topic to discuss. And so there was a big agitation against this, and even they got attacked on streets by drivers. And the media and the parties of the middle and right we're celebrating. So that's the point where we can see that the conservatives aren't that far away of AfD. Yes, and so to say AfD is the biggest danger in Germany, is the most powerful danger of the far right in Germany. There are more, and I talk about some others later, but to stay at them, it's also important to mention that AfD has a lot of connections into the far right. And for example, there is the so-called Identitäre Bewegung. It's the German version of the French Le Identitaire, and its organization, they want to give itself the image of a right intellectual group, what it's kind of absurd, but because of right intellectual, but they like have very clear and calm statements, and they have a like very biologistic racial idea, and the idea is to create an aim of a unified population, and they also have like very good connections on Instagram and TikTok, and that they spread their content. Yeah. And also a big problem is that this group, they have a lot of connections to martial art training, so they are kind of a violent group. And there was, as example, how violent they are or how dangerous they are, especially for refugees or migrants living in Germany, and they wanted to do on their own in the Mediterranean Sea. They got out and tried to push refugees away. So they are ready to fight and ready to put aggression against people coming to Germany, and that's a very very big problem. And yeah, maybe and where they got together, maybe you heard about it. There was a meeting this year in Germany in January, I think. Yes, it was in January, where it was a meeting of the right and far right, in which parts of the AfD participated and also parts of this movement, but more different groups. And in this meeting, there was like very direct plan of remigration. So they want to set ideas of bringing people out of Germany living here. And this was how could I say, surprise for the middle class, but it is only this. It's only that what AfD is talking about for years. But this was it set a start to protests, and there were a lot of protests against AfD. But these protests were dominated by the could I say this by the sorry, by the bourgeois center, and they were like more okay. We're angry, but okay, then we vote. Then okay, then it's okay if we protest once. So it wasn't like a revolutionary protest against AfD, but it was the first time that the center of the bourgeois protest. So it was it could be a perspective. Yeah, and so this was the biggest and most important and most dangerous group, but there are many more in Germany. I want to talk a little short about them because it's important to understand this dynamics, because often the right and far right is connected in Germany. Like, for example, there's this party called Die Heimat. Was a former called NPD. It's the like direct successor party of the NSDAP, like of the party of Adolf Hitler. And so it's a big difference because AfD wants to get the image to not be Nazis. They are not Nazis. They are critical. They are like racists. Yeah, they say they're racist, but they're not Nazis. And this party is a very direct Nazi party. They said, okay, we are these Nazis. And it was founded in 1964. And there was a big time when they grew in between 1966 and 1972. They were represented in 7 regional parliaments and was kind of a big danger for people coming here. But over the last years, they got smaller and smaller and nearly disappeared. But the problem is, it's not clear how much they operate out of the underground, and the connections between AfD and them are also like kind of dangerous. Yeah, and an other important point to mention is COVID-19 pandemic, because during this COVID-19 pandemic, as the Comrade and Island managed, there were a lot of protests also in Germany. And at this protest, there was a big cooperation between like bourgeois groups and also groups of the far right. And out of this cooperation, there was founded another party who only thinks about stopping the important to handle COVID-19. And it's called the Buzz, and that's like a very important thing to understand the dynamics in Germany, that during this pandemic there was like a growing of this. I'm sorry? Okay. There was a bigger connection between like people of the middle and the far right. So that's also something you can see today in the elections during, for example, European Parliament, that it made AfD stronger and more dangerous. Yeah, and there are some other little groups, like other little right-wing groups, but they are as strong as AfD and as important to mention. Like it's, for example, Dritter Weg and Pegida, maybe you heard of it. They were very strong during this big wave of refugees, this big period of migration. They come to Germany and they were very strong, but nowadays their influence is getting lower, and so it's just another part of this dynamics. But a very actual topic is Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht. Maybe you heard of it. Sarah Wagenknecht was a former member of the German left, of the left party, Die Linke, and but during this period of migration, especially in 2016, she already came up with very racist thoughts about refugees, and so over the time she was like getting away of the party Die Linke, and nowadays she, like this year, she founded her own party. It's called Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, and it's a lot about her. She's like, it's kind of a one-woman show, and it's very hard to clarify the direction because she presents a lot of positions of, for example, AfD when we talk about migration, but she has kind of like ideas of redistribution of wealth, but in general it could be another partner for AfD. Yeah, and the problem is that this party of her probably took and already probably will take and already took a lot of voters of Die Linke. So it could be a problem for the left party in Germany. And as I talked about, the situation of that AfD and Identitätsbewegung have connections to violent fighting clubs. There are like little clubs. For example, there's a group, it's called Hogeser, and is a group of, they call them hooligans against Salafists, but in general they mean against Muslims in general. And this is a group. It's not big, but it's kind of dangerous because they're very violent and they are direct racists. And yeah, they are kind of ready to fight into it. It's a big problem we have nowadays, that there is a kind of total Germany is a big aggression against migrants, and there are many people who don't feel safe anymore because they got often attacked, or they got called things and on the streets. Yeah, that it's important to mention that there was a big change of the migration dynamics in Germany, because with the growing of AfD, the German government thought to, I don't know why, maybe I don't know why, they established harder restrictions for migrants. So they basically took AfD positions on their new parliament, on the new government. For example, there's an idea of a a paying card for refugees, which is not like a normal debit or credit card. It's so the state can watch what refugees are paying. And the problem is that this card, it isn't already there, but they talk a lot about it. This card is also located to special places, so it's kind of a force to stay at one place for refugees. And the interesting point why I mentioned it is this was a point AfD demanded years ago, and nowadays the German government of liberal Green Party and Social Democrats make it into practice. So we see we see the problem. AfD talks about things, the middle took it and changed the things. Yeah, but important to mention for this is there's in Germany is like a big separation of solidarity between Ukrainian refugees and refugees coming from other countries, because Ukrainian refugees get a lot of help. What is very good, but the problem is that the refugees coming from the other countries get this hard restrictions. And even, for example, this probably upcoming card, is only for refugees out of other countries, because they like in they were there better refugees or the worse. That's important to mention that there is a very bad yes. 1 minute. Okay, yeah, and yeah, that's important too. That's one other thing, and yeah, in general, one another point. I will talk very short about Die Linke. Die Linke is the only what I mentioned, the only left party in German Bundestag, and over the years she's getting lower and lower, and she loses more influence because of a lot of arguments within the left party. And but with this but nowadays she's getting a new perspective, because this Sarah Wagenknecht is out of it, and so hopefully she could get more influence, and we will see in upcoming elections. And it's important to mention because many of our members of the ISO are also part of the party, the left, Die Linke. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very informative and very interesting, hearing about all the shades of opinion. There seem to be a lot of shades of groups on the right, quite alarming, but useful to know about these things. And so thank you very much for that information. Right, can I come to our third speaker now from France? And we're very pleased to have with us Thomas Semlar, who's a member of the NPA Executive Committee and a member of the Education Union in Toulouse. So very much welcome to you, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much to have me with you. Do you hear me? It's okay? So as you can notice with my awful accent, I'm French, so I'm very sorry for that. And my English is a little bit rusty, so I try to go on, but hopefully it will be okay. I will speak mainly about the Rassemblement National, which is the new name of what was called the National Front, which is the let's say the biggest far-right party in France. If I have some time left, I will try to speak a little bit more about the rest of the far-right groups in France, but yeah, the Zoom is asking me if my speaking language is English. I say yes. Okay, sorry. Because like I think you may know, but that a few days ago we had a special national election for the national deputies, which was called by the French President Macron. And for the first time, we had a huge fear that for the first time in the last, let's say, 70 years, 80 years, the far right could won this election and govern the country. So which was a huge fear. And by the way, the Rassemblement National did very well in this election, although they did not succeed to ride first and to get a prime minister. But I would like just to try to get few points to try to begin to understand how we get there, because if you think in 2012 the National Front had only 2 deputies and got like 3 million votes in the legislative, in the national deputy election at that time. 5 years later, they got 3 million votes and 8 deputies. And in 2022, they got 81 deputies with 4 million votes. And this year, they got 10 million votes. They arrived as the first bloc in terms of votes for the national election, and they got 142 deputies, with allies coming from the Republican right, I mean the mainstream right. So it's a huge evolvement, and of course it's quite fast. It's 12 years. In these 12 years, they are about to be able to take the government of France. And especially, I don't know if you know really well the French election, but it's not a proportional election. To get elected as a deputy, you need first to constitute a bloc of voters on your constituency, on your territories, and on the second term, if you want to be elected, you need to extend it, which means that at this election, I mean, they succeed to get 142 deputies. It's an incredible success for them, although they didn't get the government. So how we get there? The first of all is that we have a process of de-diabolization, normalization of the far right. De-diabolization is the French word that the mainstream media use to say that, well, the Rassemblement National is not anymore the boogeyman of the political field in France, but we call it normalization. In fact, you have a kind of double movement, which is first of all, a kind of facade repainting of the party by its direction, which means that in around 2014, when Marine Le Pen got the direction of the party from her father, she decided to undertake a number of moves to transform the image of the party from a populist extra-parliamentary organization into one that is supposed and able to assume power. And that's, they really clean the party in a sense. I mean, they clean the image of the party, in which like they initiate purge of figures of the party, even Jean-Marie Le Pen himself, that were like too much controversial. They purge a party of low-grade militants that were like openly neo-Nazi or anti-Semitism, or like were like a kind of skinhead violence. I mean, they really, I mean, this is facade repainting. Like they repaint the party to give it an image of like a normal mainstream party. Of course, they also change their discourse on some social issues, mainly women, for example, and they were able to articulate a kind of femo-nationalism. I mean, Aka explaining that they will be able to preserve women's rights against misogynistic migrants, misogynistic population from the ex-empire, mainly Arabs and black people and these kind of things. They also change a little bit their discourse about abortion, which like the party before was strongly against. Now the Rassemblement National has a very more open discourse about abortion. They were also changing their economical and geopolitical line toward economical neoliberalism and more like Atlantism. Although, for example, they changed completely from like until like the 2020, the line of the party on Europe was like leaving Europe. Then in the 20s, they changed. They said like openly that, well, we will not go out from Europe. We will try to transform Europe into a more national, into the preservation of all the nationalities, all the nation within the Europe. But for example, but they also change on economical issues about, I mean, leaning toward neoliberalism on the question of minimum wages, on the retirement reform, all this change to be able to be accepted by also all the economical establishment. And so this facade change, I mean, this began gradually, but this accelerated this last few years. And even this last week, during the last elections, they were still converging toward the economical establishment and trying to change all the, I mean, to change. It was a kind of contradictory for them because a part of the electorate is still like voting for a populist organization, but still they were trying to really be able to be respected by the economical establishment. The second movement is what we call the normalization, which is that this movement is coming from the exterior, from outside of the party, which is like, I mean, the National Rassemblement National, they could find a very hospitable ground within a political field that was fast leaning toward rightization. I mean, we're speaking of all political field that's even coming from the left that was moving since this last 10, 15 years toward the right. Remember that we had a left government, François Hollande, that was already making like a kind of anti-immigrant policies, that was already making like very neoliberal reforms about the wages, about the works, about already the retirement, and also within the public services. So this moved from the left already, but of course this accelerated with Macron regime for the last 7 years. But also this last governments and the political establishment organized and created also discourse that was leaning toward a right or far right about, of course, Islamophobia, xenophobia, toward population, xenophobia toward or racism toward population from the old French Empire, meaning Algeria, meaning the Arabs and the black people. Also, we got the traumatism and the backfire from the few years of terrorist attack in France, like Bataclan and in 2015 and after. And of course, migrants were like, if you think about like, we had more than 18 laws, more and more restrictive against migrants in a span of 25 years, meaning nearly one law every year. I mean, explaining that the migrants is a danger. I mean, constructing a sense of a continuous waves of migrants sweeping through France and Europe. This was, I mean, the Macron government, but also before Manuel Valls, Hollande, the left government, constructing this kind of very anti-migrants policies, and that were, of course, that were showing that, well, the National Front is saying the truth because the government, is already making its policies. So this was one part of the normalization. The second has been the mediatic normalization. Like you can see a move from the mediatic establishment for the big TV news that we have in France, that were also, really constructing this image of Muslim migrants, Black and Arab violence, and also transforming everything that is left into an anti-republic and dangerous political bloc. So we had a huge shift. Like 20 years ago, the far right was the bogeyman of the political field. They could not enter within the media, or they could not be received in the big TV news. They were not accepted by the political field, by the other political groups. And then these years, that was the left in this position. That was the left that was considered as a danger for the whole nation and the Republic, as the far right, the Rassemblement National, was considered as yes, still far right party, but accepted, nearly accepted by the political field. So this is a huge change in the span of 10, 12 years. And of course, during these 10, 12 years, they were able to build, to structure a kind of bloc, an electoral bloc. But it's not only an electoral bloc, it's a social, pre-fascist or fascist bloc. If you look to the polls, we now have more and more studies that are coming from the last election. And if you think that, well, if you ask who votes for the Rassemblement National, which sectors of the population are voting for the far right, then you understand, you get the number. The National Front got, they arrive as a political bloc first on the main votes, first on the women votes, first on the worker votes, first on the employees votes, first with the old and retired people, second within the youth, second within the middle and high bourgeoisie. And they are the very first for the people who are completely not satisfied with their level of life fulfillment. And so that's what we have to understand, how they succeed to build this bloc, from the north of France to the south of France, within the cities and within the villages. Of course, the big cities are still resisting the far-right wave. But if you look to the middle cities, to the countryside, to the suburbs, they arrive first all over the place. And how, now, how we can understand how they are building this bloc. And I think there's 3 components. Of course, the first of all is racism. The second is the depolitization. And the third is the brutalization of social and political life. And within that, we have a radicalization of part of the proletariat who does not believe anymore that any positive change can come from the political reforms or social movement. This fight is lost for them. We were in the campaign a few days ago, and it was incredible to talk to people, where we had the program of because we built a gathering of all the left, and with a kind of interesting program with some very radical, with some radical reforms. It was not revolutionary, and don't be afraid, but with some radical reforms. And the people, the only thing that they were able to say was well, we don't believe you will never be able to put this program in place. You will never be able to raise the salaries and the wages. You will never be able to gain retirement reform. And they don't believe in political reforms, but they don't believe neither in social movements. Like 1 year ago, we had a huge movement against the retirement reform of Macron, with, I mean, millions of people in the street, but there were a huge part who didn't take part in the mobilization, not because they were in favor of the reform. Of course, there were as many people against, but they just didn't believe it could be achieved. So what they can think they can win is that at least they can win a fight against strangers, Muslim, gay, minorities that they consider like either inferior or like or enemies with whom they think they are in competition. That's the point. It's like I mean, it's not new. I mean, the white trash syndrome. I mean, it's old as the US. I mean, 100 years ago. But really, you can see it. Is that then? I mean, this competition. This is a competition that it is built, of course, mediatically by the media, by the political field, but that the people like really like feel themselves that the only things that can change in their life is how can be organized the competition against like these minorities, these strangers, these non-white people, and you can find it like in schools, in everyday life. I mean, this is organized in everyday life, and I think for us it's a huge problem, because of course we are fighting racism, and of course we are trying to fight also against like social austerity, and we have like a I mean progressive politics, and we are trying to but I mean, I can tell you that these people that are now voting for the Rassemblement National, they are very far to be moved by our discourse about either like the danger of racism and the fight against racism, or by the fact that we can change their life. I mean, that we can change economically and socially their life. And so that thing, I think that this will be the huge, I mean, défi. I mean, that will be the huge things that we will be able to achieve. Is like deconstruct the racism on one side and repoliticize a big part of the Rassemblement National electorate. And when I say that racism is the center, is like this last few weeks during the electorate campaign, when people were believing that everybody was believing that the National Front will win the elections, that the media were saying that National Front will govern, that even us were afraid that this will happen, then we saw something that we never saw at this scale, was a wave of racist attacks within the whole country and society. This racist attack, of course, the most violent were organized by far-right groups, but the majority of them, they were coming from people, neighbors, teachers, I mean, schools, within the schools, like suddenly people saying openly that they were racist, openly that they didn't like the neighbors and they wanted the neighbors to move out of the neighborhoods. I mean, attacking people in the street to remove a veil or to insult foreigners or simply black people. I mean, this was like a kind of shock for a lot of us, that this kind of sudden wave of racisme décomplexé, I don't know how you say it in English, but suddenly like normal people like really releasing their racism and their hatred of minorities, racial minorities. So at least with the yes, I will be done now. I mean, maybe we can speak about within the discussion, but at least we succeed with the Front Populaire, with the gathering of the left to block the far right and the takeover of the far right. Yet I think this may be really temporary. If we do not succeed to really repoliticize all this part of people which should vote for the interest, which is voting for the left, but really, I mean, we are in a very dear situation now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for explaining all those processes about how the right is trying to normalize itself, because I think that's a really big issue for all of us. Right. Can I have some indications of who would like to speak? If you could raise your digital hands, please. Take speakers. I'll try and call three at a time. Right. Well, I've seen Rowan first of all. Anyone else, or if not, would like to speak, Rowan, and we'll see if some more people then put their hands up. So over to Rowan. Thank you.
Okay. First asking a question. Am I audible? Good. I wanted to ask, a little bit, picking on a point that was raised by Kian and Raphael. I think, I'm not sure if Thomas raised this too, but it'd be interesting to hear Thomas come back on this as well, on the influence of social media and the far right, and particularly sort of how we address this. I think this is something that we've experienced in Britain more as a social phenomenon than as a particular far right phenomenon, but we've seen plenty elsewhere, and that we're looking to with serious concern in the Starmer period in terms of the mobilization of reactionary young men, particularly in what is sometimes referred to as the sort of manosphere, sort of online, highly misogynistic, highly transphobic media ecology. But more broadly than that, I have a particular concern with the way that we're interacting with the internet and the way that we're addressing it in terms of these reactionary potentialities within it. I think the internet, or rather Web 2.0, which I think is the natural outgrowth of the internet when combined with capitalism, because I think the features of Web 2.0 are features of how you try to monetize the internet, create and media ecology that is very superficial, very orientated towards sensational content, and I think this has created a space for the far right that it hasn't for us, and that it's actually hard for us to operate within as if it's a neutral space, which I feel the left does too often, for lack of a strategy. So I'd be really interested in any thoughts on a strategy for countering the far right online, how we interact with those spheres in acknowledgement that we're not on equal ground with them, and just actually any kind of like points of sort of data on how that's developed in the different national contexts. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, can I invite John Meehan in next, please?
Thanks very much, Elizabeth. I won't take much time, and apologies in advance. I must leave the meeting early because I have to go to another meeting. But I'd like to say, in relation to what's happened in this part of Ireland, the Irish working class actually owes a great debt to the women's movement for delaying the impact of the far right in this part of the country, because there is a historical tradition of the far right in this part of Ireland, but it was intimately linked with the Catholic Church and its role in the construction of the 26 county state. And I'll just say briefly, there's been a process of mass abandonment against the political influence of the Catholic Church in this part of Ireland for the last 20, 30 years. And it's completely transformed. And the pinnacle of that, obviously, was the referendum a number of years ago, where there was a landslide vote in favour of the legalisation of abortion. Now, if you looked at the Ireland of the 1970s, you'd have thought this was unheard of. But a key political point is that the feminist issues were very necessary to fight for in their own right. But there was an indirect one, which is, as I say, it's given time to the left in Ireland that it has severely, the collapse of the Catholic Church's political influence has left the far right with a very, very big problem about how it can grow. And it has started to grow in the last couple of years. It's been the last couple of years. And obviously, it's extremely dangerous. But I mean, I'll say, just be brief here, I agree with most of what Cian said. And it is very important to construct some kind of effective left front for the next general election in this part of Ireland. Very important to do that. And I think the possibility of including, I see I'm out of time, so I'll leave it at that. I won't abuse it. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Can I see who else would like to come in? Anyone else? If not, I'll invite the speakers back in a minute. But I'd just like to sort of pick up one of the points that's being made about the situation of women. And because obviously a lot of us think traditionally of far-right ideology in terms of seeing women's role as very much narrowly defined and taking away reproductive rights and so on, or confining women to the home and so on. I've seen Roland, I'll call Roland in a minute. But what was being suggested in terms of discussion in France was that to some extent the detoxification process of the far right, or at least some sections of the far right, involved ditching some of the very, very anti-women positions. So I think it's perhaps quite an interesting one to look at how far right groups are sort of navigating this issue. I mean, Trump's running mate is particularly dire, it seems. He apparently thinks people who don't have children should have fewer democratic rights than people do have children, because we have less of a stake in the future of humanity, and has a particular animus against single women who live on their own. And I'd have a cat. It's even worse if you have a cat. It's almost like witchcraft suspicions. So I think there's some quite interesting things there. Anyway, Roland, please come in.
Thank you, Liz. I've learned a lot from each of the speakers about the growth of the far right in their own countries. But what I don't think any of them addressed was the growing internationalization of the far right. And I think that's a central thing that we need to look at. I mean, we see here the strong links between Farage and Trump and the Trump movement, but we see it across the world. We see the growth of this international involving people like Orban in Hungary, Modi in India, Netanyahu in Israel, Millet and previously, what was his name in I've already forgotten him, but he was significant in Brazil. I mean, Bolsonaro. Yeah, Bolsonaro. And we've seen, I mean, in the last Israeli election, for instance, Netanyahu, or one of the many elections there have been in the last few years, Netanyahu had huge posters around Israel of pictures of himself with Modi, with Orban, with Trump as an international statesman. I mean, these people, they're feeding into each other across the world. And what we're seeing is a pattern, I think, of setbacks in one country and advances in another. And I mean, I haven't really thought this through, but I'd be interested to hear from the speakers what their thoughts are of this growing internationalization of the far right and how we can coordinate in our efforts to combat it, not just in our own countries, but internationally.
Thanks, that's a very important point. I've got Susan or Bob, whichever.
Susan.
Susan, thank you.
Okay. No, I just wanted to raise the issue. One of the points that Roland raised was on internationalization. The other one was very important. is this normalization of the far right. And this is something where we have close media that's working together with, we have a far right media. I mean, you can thank, Rupert Murdoch, who played a very strong role in normalizing the far right. And also, we have to have both sides of the story, even though one side is saying stuff that's completely, you can listen to what they're saying. It doesn't make any sense, but they have the right to speak because of the far right. We even see this type of movement, even on Facebook, we're saying, it's okay if we disagree on political issues, because that is part of the normalization of, Donald Trump is just saying, he's not saying things that are strange. A lot of people hold these positions. And I think this is one of the most dangerous things. We've seen it in Germany. I mean, he was talking about it. We've seen it in France. We see it in the US. We know it's in Britain, where things that would never have appeared suddenly become, this is perfectly okay for us to be talking about. And we have to then listen to, mass, I don't know, they've been covering, for example, the Republican Party, as though what they're saying there is something that is normal. And then Republican Party has, as at this point, is a hard right party with, strong fascists within it. And I wanted to raise the point on internationalism, that the internationalization of the far right, which Roland had raised. And there's also a lot of money coming in from the US far right, from the Heritage Foundation. I mean, Bannon was trying to organize something in Italy, bringing all the far right together. And it's something that we need to figure. I don't know how we can stop this, because so many of us are so weak, but I think that we have a lot to learn from each other. And I just wanted, just recently, Germany said with Trump coming in that they're going to take care of European security. And I got this frisson up the back of my neck that I still haven't quite recovered from. So this is something that we need to be careful of, especially since what the comrade from Germany was saying. Thank you.
Thank you. Right. Can I invite Fred in next, please?
Yeah. Briefly, it's a question following a comment, really, about the impact of Putin on the far right in Britain, in Europe. I mean, the interesting thing about the contributions from all the three comrades is actually how there's a new Europe in construction, not one based on the original conception of some sort of, friendly, social democratic, social liberal Europe of welfare statism and so on and so forth, but a nationalist Europe, to defend European national nations and so on and so forth, led by Viktor Orban and Wilders and Meloni and Rassemblement National, and that's it's a fortress Europe, but of a different sort, a step further away from the welfare statism of the original conception of their creators, and it's something which we need to get our head around. But I just wanted to ask a question about the impact of Putin, because I think what we're also seeing is how that far right, Orban, Farage in Britain, who's a friend of Putin's, as well as he's a friend of Trump, and Internationale, have got links with the Putin, in the sense that they do see themselves as part of that general political spectrum. The Internationale, if I remember correctly, or the Front National, at least beforehand, got loans from Russian banks, which could not have been approved without the agreement of Putin. Marine Le Pen herself was received a couple of times by the president of the Duma in Russia. So there's this dual problem we have. There's dual a pull, both from the far right on the other side of the Atlantic, but the Putin pull of a strong state which is influencing, and the nationalism and racism of that state which is influencing the Orban, the Wilders, and the Melonis. So I'd like to hear what links the AfD or what impact that has in some other countries, in the other countries.
Right, thanks. I think I'm seeing two more to speak, and then I think I'd like to invite the speakers back in, and then Terry, and then I think it's Bob. Right, so Terry, please.
Trying to do too many things at once. Thanks. And thanks to all the speakers. It has indeed been very fascinating. I wanted to pick up 2 points. Firstly, in terms of racism, which I think all the speakers talked about as a central aspect of what the far right has been mobilizing around. And I guess what I'm interested to know is what's the response to that ramping up of racism, because as they all said, racism is not new in any of their contexts, but what the ramping up of that rhetoric and the echoing of it by the establishment parties is meaning, in terms of, is there any self-organization of resistance in communities of Black populations, of Muslim populations, of migrant populations, and what do comrades think the potential for that is? I know the history of migration is different in each of those countries, but I'd be very interested to know about that. And then the second point was about COVID. I don't think Thomas mentioned it, but both Kian and Raphael talked about what happened during the pandemic, and that seemed to me to be quite important in terms of the growth of the far right. It certainly was in Britain. And I think it relates to the point about social media, because it was about the peddling of conspiracy theories, and the way that notions of conspiracy, anti-science, a completely insane attitude to health was perpetrated by the far right in that period. And again, I'd be interested to know how the left tried to respond in your different countries during that period to those myths and that mobilization. Thanks.
Right, thank you very much. I've got two more people indicated to speak. Shall I take them and then invite the speakers back? Right, so I think it's Bob and then Jeff. Right, so Bob, please.
Okay, a number of points. I think we have to recognize that from the 1970s onwards, there was a development of new forms of racism in different countries, and the rise and crisis of neoliberalism actually increased the individualistic tendencies throughout Europe. And one of the paradoxes we have to deal with is, it's a matter of fact that it is easier to sell bullshit. It is to actually put over a well-argued set of positions. One of the problems I find when we talk about fighting the far right, which is what we must do, is that often there is a lack of analysis of why we are not winning over more people to the anti-racist, anti-fascist, pro-socialist argument. And I think we've got to recognize how the fascist and far right are very good at using opportunism, and by actually playing on people's fears, on playing on defeatist ideas, So what I come myself from Germany about people say, sorry, I'm in France, saying that they don't believe we can win our demand, that we can be transformative, is about the inbuilt defeatism that exists in politics, and that of course goes hand in hand with the depoliticization of very much the culture, and in many ways social media actually fits that narrative, because it's always about the immediate and moving on. There is no stability. That means it is easy to put forward more propagandist and common sense based ideas. So we've got to rethink about how we connect with community and political forces to start to build a new consciousness about why opposing fascism and racism has to be a priority.
Thank you very much, Bob. Right, can I call in Jeff, and then I think we may bring the speakers back in. Right, Jeff?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Bob's just said. The problem is that in Britain in particular, racism is extremely deeply rooted. I mean, you'll find it in Tudor times. I've just read a book about First World War, and contrary to all the beliefs, Belgian refugees were partially welcomed in Britain, but they were also hated and despised and told, our lads are dying for you, get yourselves back to Belgium. So there's quite a long history of hostility in Britain to immigrants. And that is something that is very difficult to deal with, because the belief that we have a common interest because we happen to be born in this particular bit of the world is very deeply held inside large sections of the working class. Secondly, I mean, I'm sure John Meehan's absolutely right about the role of the women's movement in holding back the growth of the far right in Ireland. But there's also a big backlash against that. We have Farage praising Andrew Tate, for example. I mean, he deplores his manners or something, but essentially there is a big backlash against a lot of the gains of the feminist movement over the last decade or so, or 2 decades. And thirdly, there's now a backlash against environmentalism, which has certainly been taken up in Britain by reform. I think it's also true in Germany now. I'm not sure about the situation in France. It would be good to hear about that. But even the gains that we have made are now under threat. And finally, I mean, what Fred says about Putin, yes, and the essentially fascist international, that's absolutely true. I think the biggest victims of that are going to be the people of Ukraine, because, Trump has said that he can end the war in Ukraine overnight. Vance has said pretty much the same thing. And what they mean is they won't allow any weapons to go to Ukraine, and the people of Ukraine will be slaughtered by Putin's troops. And Ukraine, or at least large parts of Ukraine, will be forcibly incorporated into Russia and end that.
Right, thank you very much for those points. Right, can I invite the speakers back in now, I think. Not seeing anyone else at the end to speak. I'll start with Thomas. We'll go in reverse order. So,
okay, fine. I don't know if I will be able to, if I will succeed to answer all the questions or the comments. Let's begin. But I agree with Bob. I mean, of course, the rise of neoliberalism and the decrease of individualism. It's. I think it's a huge part of what is happening to us. Is that the destruction of the social fabric, the communal solidarities, I mean, on every level, in the workplace, in the schools, in the neighbors, that's a huge point of what we are facing now, and the COVID on that, I think, was an accelerator of for me. It was not something like I mean, it did not introduce something new, but it accelerated, in France at least, the destruction, I mean, faster of the social fabric, of the solidarities, I mean, of the small mobilization that were existing like on the local level before. That was the effect of the COVID, that was putting everybody, I mean, isolated within their walls, in front of the television and the social networks. And of course, the far right, they are years ago from us on the social media. I mean, that's a reality. They have like a huge, a kind of ecological environment. I mean, in France, you can see like on the social media, I mean, they are able to have like a many sites, many networks connected together, responding to together, creating waves together, which like we are completely unable to confront. I mean, for me, that's the reality of the social media. I mean, Bardella, which is the new, which will be the successor or the competitor of Marine Le Pen, which is the president of the Rassemblement National now. I mean, is a star on TikTok. I mean, he's a star on TikTok, which means that by TikTok, by this media, he was able to won, I mean, a huge level of youth from 13, 14 to 20. I mean, 20 years. I mean, this. I mean, I'm a teacher, but I mean, many of my colleagues within the high school and before, like since 1 year, they're telling me that he's a political star because they were able to use all these social media much better than us, but also because it corresponds much better, because in a sense, also the far right, I mean, is where we are trying to build local solidarities, physical networks, communal life, social fabric within the people. The far right, they just need to have like one isolated people, I mean, across another to spread their message. And so for them, the social media, it's great for that. I mean, they don't ask people. I mean, also something I didn't tell. I mean, it's incredible because I mean, we were making this electoral campaign. We had like 100,000, dozens of hundreds of thousands of people making the campaign, where like the Rassemblement National was not making a campaign. You could not see, I mean, militants of the National Front in the street making the campaign. They were not. They were just using social networks. They were like just speaking on the TV, and that's it. So I think, of course, for me, there is like a very strong link between this phenomenon and the rise of the far right. Now, about the internationalization, of course, you're right. I mean, this is a huge thing. I mean, here again, I think they are much more organized, much more in advance than us. Of course, they also have much more money to organize that. But for sure, I mean, the comrades from Germany was speaking about one leader I mean, that was part of a movement with Génération Identitaire in France. I know very well the operation he was speaking about. That was financed by the US. I mean, when they were sending helicopters in the Alps to make their operation, very mediatic operation with like German people, Italian, French, that was all financed by the US. I mean, so of course, they are much more internationalized than us. I mean, we are the ones who are claiming internationalism. We are the ones who are claiming like building links with like all over the world. But I can tell you that they're much more organized, much more potent, much more effective than us. I mean, that's for sure. Now about Putin, for me, is part of the far right, or at least he is pushing the far right everywhere he can in Europe and elsewhere. Now, the Rassemblement National was very close to him until 2 years ago. Now they change in some way. I mean, they move a little bit the line to be much more. I mean, they're trying to find a neutral position between Ukraine and NATO on one side and Putin on the other. But still, of course, they have a huge acquaintance with Putin. Now, last thing about the resistance against racism within the communities. Of course, there is, and fortunately for us, there is resistances, and within the communities, within the minorities, in the popular area where the population from the ex-empire is concentrated. Of course there is, but also they are in, how can I say, they are fighting from a very bad position and from above, which is quite difficult in reality. And we have these difficulties making the articulation between the political field on one side and this social movement of resistance against racism, and especially the communities' resistance, which are, in a sense, isolated also. And that's our problem, by the way. That's the problem of the left. How it is that, at least in France, we never succeed to integrate all this movement, this resistance movement, community-based resistance movement within the political left and the radical left. I mean, there's still a big gap that we have to cross. I think I'm done.
Right, thank you very much. Can I invite Raphael in next, please? Oh, excellent. Can you unmute, please?
I'm sorry, you're talking to me?
Turn now if you'd like to contribute further to the discussion, please.
Yeah, my internet was down for a moment, so that's why I haven't answered. I'm sorry. Yeah, I want to add some points of what the impact of Putin is on AfD, because in Germany there's a lot of discussions about weapons and giving weapons to Ukraine, and AfD is on the point that they say they are the party for peace, so they don't want to give weapons, but on the other hand, they're like good friends of Putin. And there was also like this kind of scandal that there were spies of Putin in AfD and they had a good connection. So they're just supporting the Putin regime. And yeah, but I'm not as deep in this point, but I want to add something else on this social media topic, because AfD is the German party which has the best social media presence. They are very good on TikTok. Like it's very easy to get AfD content, and they have like how could I say, they realized what to do with TikTok and they use it in the perfect way. And that's a very, very dangerous topic, because I work with children in a youth center, and there we talk a lot about this content because they see it all the time and they get these ideas and these very short ideas of this okay, this they just say, okay, it's we take it, and that's a big problem. So, but I think the problem is also like that the left hasn't any good social media competent skills. Like the organization in which I am, we have like a very small social media presence, and I think as a European or maybe global left, we have to make a better presence there. And another point I want to mention was about the response of population on AfD. Like I mentioned, this protests, but important to say, at this big protest, when they found out that these AfD meeting where they want to talk about kicking people out of Germany, they were based on very like they were very wide protests. It wasn't like good connection between migrant organizations or and not migrant organizations, because I think there's a problem that they're in this anti-AfD dynamics. There's also like a kind of racist structures which we have to overcome to participate together, and so it wasn't that much of a protest thrown by migrants. And in general, it's sad to say that the left in Germany is very, very down. So we are so far away of having like a not sorry, like we are very far away of having a concrete action plan, or like we aren't like connected. And the problem is that when these protests happen, the governmental parties get a big part of this protest and don't leave any space for the left or radical left to bring their points up. So we have the problem that protests against AfD are very dominated by them, and so it doesn't makes any efforts, because they want to keep like they want to keep it like it is, and they, as I mentioned, they make this laws against migrants so they can wash their image, and that's a big problem. Yeah, I thought it was everything I want to mention, but if I forgot something, please tell me.
Thank you very much. Can I invite a comment from Ireland? Kian, are you there?
I am. So firstly, sorry that I haven't been able to participate more. It's just things are very hectic at the moment. There's no stop, because we're just out of one election and we're getting ready for another. So it's all go, and I'm on a bus here now as well. So, but just to comment on some of the things, I think the point about social media is interesting, because it's an international phenomenon where that partly, let's be clear, it's by choice that Elon Musk, in his control of X or Twitter, but also Facebook has done the same, have deplatformed, have promoted left-wing content, and have given a clear running for the far right on these social networks. So it's partly that a lesson for us that the talk that had been there before, that these were somehow neutral spaces or great global commons, is not true. These are spaces controlled by billionaires, and they can use their control to set the agenda, and that's part of what we're seeing as well here. But I agree, part of it as well is just that the left needs to learn how to meme better. The left needs to lean into the anger and the righteous indignation that people have, and try to find ways of popularizing that in populist or but principled ways. And I think that is something that we need to become more attuned to. And I think there's a lot of lessons there for us on that. But I also think that we can't lose sight of the left is strongest when it's about organizing people directly. So that's door-to-door community work, that's trade unions and workplace struggles. We do better. The right does well when people are atomized and just shouting at home. We do better when we bring people together in the community or in the workplace, in the unions, or in people power protests. So the other thing that I'd say on that is I think that the Palestine solidarity movement has been a big opportunity in Ireland, and I think is one area where we have seen a left and anti-imperialist message resonate and gain momentum, and a potential there to organize people, not just online viral messaging, but also in practice organizing direct actions and mass protests. And I think the left needs to be quick to respond and take up those issues where they come. And then the final thing that I say is, look, I think that I think that this is the period we're in is one of revolution and counter-revolution, is one of radicalization, and on the left and on the right. And I think, like in my introduction, I talked about some of the big things that had sparked the growth of the far right, the refugee crisis, the COVID crisis. In some ways, you could see these as just being random bolts from the blue. You could think that they were just they just were specific things that happened, and maybe if they didn't happen, we'd be in a different situation. But on another deeper sense, actually, the COVID crisis and the refugee crisis, the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, are also symptoms of capitalism, of a capitalist crisis as a whole. And I think we are now in a long-running period of more and more refugee crises, more and more pandemics, and shocks to the system like that. And therefore, we need to be building those broad left united fronts, but also within that, building a strong, principled revolutionary left to try to give voice to that anger of working class people, try to direct it towards the root causes rather than directing it downwards at refugees and migrants. Again, just to say sorry if I missed any questions, and I'm sorry that I didn't get to participate more, but I look forward to the future discussions and collaboration. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, comrade. I must say I'm rather in awe of your capacity to travel and Zoom at the same time. I think that's really rather impressive. I'd like to say thank you to all the speakers. I'd like to thank everyone for their contributions. I think we've covered many areas. Obviously, this has been recorded, so if you have any friends who've missed this, who do want to see it, please do draw their attention to the fact the recording will be available. Can I also remind people that next Wednesday, we have the launch of the Eco-Socialist Manifesto, which we have been putting quite a lot of work into. So it'd be nice if people turned up for that meeting and that discussion. That's, I believe, at 7:30. And the link for joining it is in the chat, and also, of course, on the ACR website. Can I just check whether there are any more announcements? Or if not, I'd like to say thank you to everyone. I think a round of applause for our speakers. And, those of you who are not home, wishing you safe journeys home. But I think most people are at home, so just enjoy the rest of the evening, and hope to see a lot of you. Raphael would like to come in on something, right?
Yes, I'm sorry, I have another question. But I want to say, is this only a one-time meeting, or maybe do we meet again, like in this constellation, to talk about the development of the countries? Because I think there will be a lot of change, and so I think maybe it's good to meet again. So I just want to ask.
I'm seeing a lot of friendly faces and nodding heads and positive gestures about the idea of meeting again, because I think we've had so many things in the discussion which have been experiences in several countries, like the problems of the far right trying to normalize itself, the question of the relationship with the women's movement and the far right and women's issues, the whole question of the COVID pandemic and how that issue was taken up, the question of refugees and the question of the internationalization of the far right, and of course, Putin's war on Ukraine and how those things are connected. And obviously, we're all very worried about the election in the USA, which is coming up. So we'll
Yeah.
certainly be wanting to have some meeting around that, I should think. So, I mean, it's not for me to say, but I think people would be keen on having further meetings. And this is the point about internationalism, isn't it? That we actually talk to each other and we learn from each other's experiences. And, you know, because we're all dealing with some of these problems about the left is not as strong as we would like it to be, to put it mildly. And it's a question of how do we organise, how do we build things in the unions and so on. So I think we can certainly take that away and talk about it. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of interest in having further meetings. So I think it is probably time now for me to close the meeting. But say thank you to everyone very much for their contributions. And please do come to the meeting next Wednesday when we're launching the Eco-Socialism Manifesto. Right, so thank you very much, everyone. I think we're now about a few minutes before the end of the meeting, so about time to end. So thank you very much, everyone.
Cheers. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, comrades.
Thank you. Bye.
Transcript is
Thanks.
saved. We can
Thanks
close.
a lot.
No, we can't. I need to switch